Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 6 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify their current rankings as we approach Week 6. I'll also be talking about matchups at both positions, giving you guys an understanding as to which defenses thus far this season on average have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks, so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. With many players to cover, we'll get into it in just a moment. A reminder, there are timestamps down in the description of every video. So if you're looking for a specific player, be sure to travel down to the description and find those that are on roster so you can determine who you're starting going into Week 6. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So whether it is our rankings videos throughout the weeks, our live streams later tonight after the Thursday night football game, I will be live streaming here on the channel. I'll also be live streaming Saturday afternoon 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and Sunday morning from 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time up until kickoff 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So be sure to subscribe to the channel, stay up to date on my latest content, and we are very close to achieving our goal of 80,000 subscribers, so help us get there. Thank you very much for the support. Also, on the subject of Thursday Night Football, at the end of today's video, I will be putting together a pick'em slip for Thursday night's football game between the Kansas City Chiefs and Denver Broncos. So for those of you who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, travel down to the description of the video and check out the link. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you eligible for the first-time deposit match up to $500, which is at a limited time basis, so be sure to take advantage of the opportunity. You're also going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours for the remainder of the season. These are rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, top 120 flex, all-encompassing rankings to help you guys out every single Sunday for the remainder of the season. So for those of you who are interested, make sure to check out the map on the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. Also, like I was mentioning, Thursday Night Football, going into tonight's game, new customers who sign up and make a first-time deposit will have an opportunity of pushing Patrick Mahomes 0.5 total yards, cashing in on the pick'ems, and having fun for Thursday Night Football. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's get into talking about the tight end position, beginning with matchups. As we can see, the New York Jets are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends thus far this season on average in terms of receiving statistics isolated in a half PPR scoring format, okay? I'm purely isolating receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. And with that information, there are a lot of teams that are allowing double-digit fantasy points to opposing tight ends thus far this season on average. And typically, we want to go ahead and play our tight ends against the New York Jets. Dallas Goedert has himself a great opportunity of having himself another upside week based on the overall matchup, despite the fact that he wasn't given many opportunities early on in the season, but as of late has certainly been a huge part of that offense, with Devonta Smith taking a little bit of a backseat role within the overall scheme. Nonetheless, the Atlanta Falcons, another one of these advantageous matchups. That's great for Logan Thomas. As we're all aware, Eric Bieniemy, the former offensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs, moving on to the Washington Commanders, he has put an influence on this offense to want to get the tight end position heavily involved. And we saw that last week, and hopefully that momentum is only going to continue going into this week. Now, on the other end of this entire, matchups conversation, we have teams that are really good against opposing tight ends. And some of these teams haven't played against elite tight ends. Therefore, the overall statistics that they have allowed to opposing tight ends doesn't really give us a pure understanding as to whether or not this could be a potential advantageous matchup. But the Baltimore Ravens, New Orleans Saints, Buffalo Bills, New England Patriots, Arizona Cardinals, they have played very well against opposing tight ends thus far this season. Again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that if you were to play against Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, TJ Hockenson over the course of an entire season, you're going to get a lot of points dropped on your head in comparison to going up against, guys like Adam Trotman, Irv Smith, or Hayden Hurst. So over the course of today's video, if there is a specific tight end who has a better matchup than it is currently presented, I will mention it. So speaking of those tight ends, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about my top 16 tight ends going into the week, beginning with our number one, Travis Kelce, who plays later tonight against the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos thus far this season are allowing 12.52 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. That's the 7th best matchup at the position, and obviously one that we want to take advantage of. In the last couple weeks, they have not only given up 7 catches and 81 receiving yards to New York Jets tight ends, but they've also given up 10 receptions, 111 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns to Chicago Bears tight ends. And even Washington Commanders tight ends, 7 catches, 89, and a touchdown against this defense. The fact of the matter is the Denver Broncos defense is a liability, and regardless of whether it's running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, or tight ends, they're all succeeding against the matchup. Therefore, Travis Kelce, the higher potential upside he has, the better for our fantasy football purposes. Even though he is dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury that he sustained in last week's game against the Minnesota Vikings, he should be a full go in tonight's game. Moving on to our number 2, we have TJ Hockenson. TJ Hockenson takes on the Chicago Bears. Again, the Chicago Bears defense has not been great all season long. And even though they played technically better against Sam Howell, they weren't able to stop the tight end position. Logan Thomas last week had himself an incredible game, but all the tight ends of the Washington Commanders last week combined for 12 receptions, 105 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. But that's not the only time the Chicago Bears have given up their fair share of points to opposing tight ends. The Kansas City Chiefs tight ends, 8 catches, 68, and a touchdown. This is the 9th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 11.44 fantasy points per game. TJ Hockenson, with the absence of Justin Jefferson, has an increased potential of target opportunity, considering the fact that this offense is throwing the ball more than any other team in terms of passing rate in the National Football League. Passing attempts comparative to rushing attempts, they are throwing the ball 70+% of the time over the course of the season, and they're not slowing up anytime soon, considering the absence of Justin Jefferson is only going to make it harder for this offense to move the ball, which should lead to far more passing late in games, and obviously TJ Hockenson benefiting from that. Moving on to our number 3, we have Mark Andrews. Again, Mark Andrews is another one of these stud tight ends at the position. Thus far this season, he has finished as a top 12 tight end in 3 of his last 4 games. But what Mark Andrews does just about better than any other tight end at the position is his overall for upside. Even though he's been a top 12 tight end in 3 out of the last 4 games, 2 of those overall weeks have been the number 2 and number 3 ranked tight end within that given week. The upside that Mark Andrews can achieve in comparison to other tight ends is significantly higher because of the utilization that he gets within the red zone and the offense not really having a premier number 1 wide receiver. Even though Zay Flowers is getting himself a lot of targets, OBJ, Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, they're not doing enough within this offense, and their running backs really haven't been great thus far this season. It just continues to lead to Mark Andrews getting himself a higher workload of opportunity, 10 total targets this last week, and hopefully finding himself in the end zone within the given week. Moving on to our number 4, Sam LaPorta. I mean, he is breaking records every single week, and he's truly been pushing the conversation as to whether or not a rookie tight end can find success in their first year. And by all means, coming off of a week in which he had 18.2 fantasy points, 2 receiving touchdowns, an incredible overall week. Thus far this season, again, a 19.5% target share, 20+% target share within the red zone. And even though he has a little bit of a tougher matchup considering the linebackers and the coverage that he'll see from Devin White and Levante David is a little bit more difficult than what he was, facing last week against the Carolina Panthers, the expectation is that he's going to continue to be a mainstay within this offense. And considering Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown were out last week, you would have expected Sam LaPorta to get 4 more target upside. He only had 4 targets and 3 receptions. Regardless of who is available within this lineup, we know he's going to get a lot of utilization. And of course, they're scheming up plays in order to get him open for touchdowns, which matters the most. Moving on to our number 5, we have George Kittle. It only took 5 weeks for George Kittle to finally get himself at the top of the tight end conversation within a given week. Now, unfortunately, last week's performance, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 3 receiving touchdowns, that is very volatile, but at this point, better late than never. The fact of the matter is there are a lot of mouths to feed within that offense, and taking on the Cleveland Browns this upcoming week, I don't see it as an advantageous matchup specifically for George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, or Brandon Ayuk, but the effectiveness of Kyle Shanahan's offense and the fact that we are most likely going to be in a situation where Deshaun Watson is not active for this game, the Browns defense, yes, even though they are at the top of the conversation in terms of all statistical categories this season defensively, without their quarterback, there's going to be a lot of 3-and-out situations, which are going to lead to a lot of short field opportunities for the 49ers, who are the best team in the National Football League, in my opinion, which are only going to give them more and more opportunities to score. Again, if you just go back a couple weeks, Mark Andrews against that defense, due to the fact that there was no Deshaun Watson in that game and DTR was the starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, it opened up the opportunity for Mark Andrews to have 5 catches, 80 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. We're hoping for upside in that case from George Kittle. Moving on to our number 6, we have Dallas Goedert. Like I mentioned earlier, the New York Jets matchup is the best at the position. They are allowing 14.48 fantasy points per game thus far this season. Just giving you a little bit of the context as to which tight ends have really dominated against that defense. Broncos tight ends this last week, 4 catches, 26 and a touchdown. Chiefs tight ends, 7 for 94 and a touchdown. Patriots tight ends, 5 for 106 in a touchdown. Cowboys tight ends with 4 catches, 12 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Nick Sirianni made it a point last week to say, hey, even though we haven't gotten Dallas Goedert in the mix thus far, he is still a part of this offense at a major capacity. And going forward, we're only going to see him continue to get more and more targets within this offense. When we go ahead and check out the next-gen stats on the bottom of the screen, that one reception that he had on a little bit of a wheel route towards the sideline, they had a defensive end covering him. I mean, the fact that that is going to be the case, obviously they're going to take advantage of all the mismatches that is posed against Dallas Goedert. And when they do, obviously he's going to have himself fantastic fantasy performances. Moving on to our number 7, we have Evan Engram. Evan Engram, every game he has played against the Indianapolis Colts as a member of the Jacksonville Jaguars, has been successful thus far. I mean, if you look at earlier this season, 5 targets, 5 catches, 49 receiving yards, 7.4 fantasy points. We'll take that. You even go back to last season. In those 2 games, week 2 and week 6, had himself 8.1 fantasy points, 6.5 fantasy points. Even though Evan Engram does not have the upside of a touchdown in comparison to guys like Zay Jones, Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, Travis Etienne within this offense, he is still going to get himself a high volume of targets in comparison to the rest of the tight end position. And with those overall opportunities in terms of receptions and receiving yards, he'll be able to be within this top 8 conversation at the tight end position. Moving on to our number 8, we have Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas, like I mentioned earlier, with Eric Bieniemy's influence within this offense, they obviously want to utilize the tight end position at a high capacity. Last week, Logan Thomas, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And luckily for this upcoming week, he has the second best matchup at the position, taking on the Atlanta Falcons, who have allowed 13.36 fantasy points per game. Most recently, 8 catches, 87 yards, and a touchdown to Texans tight ends. Jags tight ends combined for 9 catches, 69 yards. Lions tight ends, I mean, it was mainly just Sam LaPorta, 8 catches, 84 and a touchdown. Panthers tight end, 6 catches, 43 and a touchdown. The vast majority of teams that have taken on the Atlanta Falcons this season that have had relevant tight ends within their offense have obviously seen themselves a lot of success. Here's another great week for Logan Thomas on the horizon. Moving on to our number 9, we have Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet, as long as Justin Fields continues to play well, of course, by proxy, Cole Kmet is going to benefit from that. Primarily because Cole Kmet has been one of his main receiving touchdown options over the course of the last 2 seasons. Specifically, if you go ahead and look at the last 16 games in which Cole Kmet has played with Justin Fields has passed for 26 passing touchdowns in the last 16 games. Of those 26 touchdowns, 9 of them have gone in the direction of Cole Kmet. That's 35% of the overall passing touchdowns in his direction. So if in fact we're going to be in a conversation where Justin Fields for another consecutive week can score himself 3 or more touchdowns, at least one of them are going to go in the direction of Cole Kmet, which obviously will bode very well for our fantasy purposes. Going into the given week, they take on the 14th best matchup. The Minnesota Vikings are allowing 9.9 fantasy points per game. Most recently in the given season, the Chargers tight ends, 8 catches, 34, 2 touchdowns. Chiefs tight ends, 12 catches, 88, and a touchdown. Cole Kmet as a main priority option within this offense and the number 2 receiving option of Justin Fields, I'm expecting to have another great week here. Moving on to our number 10, we have Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz saved this week with a receiving touchdown. And even though he could have had himself a receiving touchdown in week 4, could have had himself a receiving touchdown in week 1, one of those were Josh Dobbs' fault, the other was his fault. Luckily, he finally found the end zone. But the lack of overall opportunity that he was given in an advantageous matchup taking on the Cincinnati Bengals was alarming. The fact that he only had 2 receptions on 4 targets doesn't really, sit well with me. But nonetheless, we have another week to kind of regain overall upside from Zach Ertz. In last week's performance against the LA Rams, Dallas Goedert went for 8 catches, 117 and a touchdown, over 21 fantasy points. In week 4, the Colts tight ends combined for 6 catches, 107 and 2 touchdowns, over 25 fantasy points against the LA Rams defense. Zach Ertz as the primary receiving option at the tight end position for this offense. Trey McBride, obviously still a kind of secondary option at the tight end position, should have himself an upside week with an advantageous matchup on hand. Moving on to our number 11, Darren Waller. The expectation for the New York Jets offense is that Daniel Jones is not going to play in the game this upcoming Sunday night, primarily because he did not practice Wednesday and he did not practice earlier today, Thursday. Even though Darren Waller has been dealing with himself a groin injury, he did end up participating in practice earlier today, which has him on track to play on Sunday's game. Last week was the best performance that Darren Waller has put forth thus far this season with the New York Giants. 11 targets, 8 receptions, 86 receiving yards, and all he needed was the opportunity to be able to find that upside. But going into the week without Daniel Jones, it may hurt him. But when you go ahead and look at last week's game in the 4th quarter on the 2 drives in which Tyrod Taylor was the quarterback leading the New York Giants down the field, on those 2 drives, he targeted Darren Waller 4 times, 3 receptions, 31 receiving yards. If this is going to be a negative game script, Tyrod Taylor is going to be the starting quarterback of the New York Giants. I'm expecting him to continue to look in the direction of the number 1 receiving option, Darren Waller, and hopefully he can see himself a lot of target opportunity in a game in which they'll be losing for a majority of the contest. Moving on to our number 12, we have Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts coming off of the best game of his season as well. 11 targets, 7 receptions, 87 receiving yards. Again, very similar to Darren Waller. You give these guys opportunities and they're going to be able to deliver. And considering the fact that Desmond Ridder played so much better this last week, had over a 70% passing completion percentage, threw for over 300 passing yards, that certainly helps. But it allowed Kyle Pitts to get to a position where he set a career high in total targets. 11 targets, he had never seen that before. I mean, even just his receptions count. 7 overall receptions is the most that he has had since week 7 of 2021. 87 receiving yards is the most receiving yards he has had since week 3 of 2022. Kyle Pitts throughout his career has very seldom seen this overall expansion of opportunity. And if they're going to continue with this going into the matchup against the Washington Commanders, by all means, I'm hoping for another one of these consistent performances to where he can get himself 8 to 10 to 12 potential fantasy points, even if he isn't scoring a touchdown within this offense. Luckily for them this week, Desmond Ridder at home again. If you go ahead and look at the home versus away splits for Desmond Ridder, at home this season in the 3 games he has played, 71% passing completion percentage. Away this season, the 2 games he has played, 58% passing completion percentage. We're hoping for Kyle Pitts to have himself another big week here. Moving on to our number 13, we have Jake Ferguson. You know, the Cowboys genuinely miss Kellen Moore, and they take on the Los Angeles Chargers. It's going to be a revenge game for Kellen Moore. We'll talk about that in just a moment with Justin Herbert at the quarterback conversation. But as of the last couple weeks, this Dallas Cowboys offense has been very underwhelming. Tony Pollard, CeeDee Lamb, neither of them have found their overall upside. Quite frankly, neither of them are getting a lot of opportunity within this offense. And even though they have seen a couple matchups in which they are blowing out the opposing team, even against the Arizona Cardinals, neither of them were able to find themselves overall upside. We're hoping that Jake Ferguson going into the given week can be one of these mainstays within this offense that is going to see himself a consistent target count. Considering Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks really aren't premier receivers within this offense, Jake Ferguson is probably the number 2 receiving option going forward. And against the Los Angeles Chargers, an advantageous matchup, I'm firing him up. Number 14 is Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin in the last 2 games has had himself 4 receptions for 67 yards and 4 receptions for 58 yards. Obviously, Zach Wilson has played far better in the last 2 games, and the tight end utilization within this offense, whether it is, even guys like CJ Uzomah, are overall increasing. Within a negative game script, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, even though this can be seen as an advantageous matchup, the only tight ends who have really played well against this defense is Hunter Henry in week 1 and TJ Hockenson in week 2, while their safeties and linebackers were injured. But now that those guys are back, I'm expecting this to be a little bit more of a difficult matchup for Tyler Conklin within the given week. We move on to Jonnu Smith on number 15. Again, Jonnu Smith has been balling out in the last 4 games. 6.7, 6.2, 12.5, 7.7. And you may be thinking, Andrew, how is that balling out? At the tight end position, I can assure you it is. In the last 4 games, he is the number 9 overall tight end in fantasy football. Just to put that into perspective. Not only that, he is still seeing himself a good opportunity share in comparison to Kyle Pitts, who is also getting himself a vast majority of the targets within this offense. Obviously, like I mentioned just moments ago with Kyle Pitts, Desmond Ridder at home, a completely different quarterback. Thus far this season at games at home, 71% passing completion percentage. On the road, 58%. They play at home against the Washington Commanders in the given week. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Tyler Higbee. They do take on the Arizona Cardinals. It really is difficult to choose from 16 and on. I think that Tyler Higbee could probably put together a decent performance, but considering the return of Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, it is going to be difficult. I'm assuming that this offense is going to be firing on all cylinders against this Arizona Cardinals defense, and that almost all of them can benefit from that fact. It's going to take a couple receptions, specifically down in the red zone, for Tyler Higbee to be able to kind of amass a better ranking than number 16. But considering his overall targets, receptions that we've seen over the course of the last month of the season, I think it's fair to have him at number 16. Okay, let's move on to the quarterback conversation. Before we do, let me remind you guys, if you haven't checked out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel, be sure to do so today. Again, with all the support you guys have shown us thus far this season, all purchases for the remainder of the season will have free shipping. So I cannot thank you guys enough for supporting the channel with, grabbing yourself the high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your upcoming stressful fantasy football Sundays with the 1.01 brand. And greetings and salutations. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about quarterback matchups going into the given week. As we can see on screen, the Denver Broncos are the easiest matchup at the position, as they're allowing over 20 fantasy points per game, along with the Chicago Bears. So, of course, Patrick Mahomes should have himself a great week, and so should Kirk Cousins, even though he does not have Justin Jefferson within that offense. Going into the given week, of course, we want to take advantage of those matchups. The Philadelphia Eagles, Zach Wilson's not a quarterback that we're starting in any sort of capacity. The Los Angeles Chargers, maybe Dak Prescott could have himself a bounce back week. Desmond Ridder taking on the Washington Commanders, that could be in the realm of possibility, but ultimately they gave up 4 of the 7 touchdowns that they've allowed this season just this last week. So just putting that into perspective, understand that some of these numbers have been skewed based on a couple performances here and there. The Minnesota Vikings giving up their fair share of points. Speaking of Justin Fields, he can have himself another upside performance against a team that is allowing a lot of passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. Again, Justin Fields coming off of back-to-back games of 4 passing touchdowns. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, some of the defenses that have played very well against opposing quarterbacks, the Cleveland Browns, Buffalo Bills, New Orleans Saints, Dallas Cowboys, San Francisco 49ers. We know that whoever plays quarterback for the Cleveland Browns this week is going to struggle. And it is looking like that's probably going to be PJ Walker. If you have the San Francisco 49ers defense, obviously fire them up. In the case of the Dallas Cowboys defense, I mean, we just saw Brock Purdy tear apart this defense. Justin Herbert, Kellen Moore, a revenge game. I think they're going to be in a pretty good spot. I wouldn't worry too much about that matchup overall. The New Orleans Saints taking on CJ Stroud. Can he continue his success and continue his streak of not throwing an interception, despite the fact that, of course, the New Orleans Saints have forced 6 interceptions to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season? Time will tell. Let's get into our top 16 conversation at the quarterback position, beginning with our number 1. The player who plays tonight, Patrick Mahomes, taking on the Denver Broncos, the easiest matchup at the position. Thus far this season, the Denver Broncos are allowing 20.47 fantasy points per game. And in last season's matchups against the Denver Broncos, Patrick Mahomes was able to have himself 3 passing touchdowns in both games. There is a conversation to have where Patrick Mahomes could go for a boatload of fantasy points tonight. That is the hope. And hopefully he doesn't settle for a game in which he gets himself 20 fantasy points, which kind of is the expectation. But hopefully he can go far beyond that, have himself a 3 or 4 passing touchdown performance. If in fact we just isolate all of the other games that the Denver Broncos have played outside of the matchup against the Miami Dolphins in which they had 70 points dropped on their head, if you go ahead and look in the 4 other games in which they've participated in, that Denver Broncos defense is still allowing 28 points per game. And when we go ahead and isolate those 4 other games, the Denver Broncos defense is still allowing 2.75 offensive touchdowns per game thus far this season to opposing offenses. Patrick Mahomes in a fantastic position, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. On a short week, I'm expecting him to ball out. Moving on to our number 2, we have Josh Allen. Josh Allen takes on the New York Giants. And the New York Giants, I mean, besides the fact that they're most likely not going to have Daniel Jones, they're going to have a beat-up offensive line. Their linebackers, their secondary, everyone's injured on this team. I mean, even Saquon Barkley may not even play because they already know they're taking on the Buffalo Bills, and this could be a matchup in which they get rolled. So if you go into the matchup and we take into account the fact that the New York Giants, they have allowed the most rushing touchdowns to opposing offenses thus far this season. They've allowed 9 rushing touchdowns. And the fact that the Buffalo Bills, they're number 5 amongst all teams in terms of total rushing touchdowns scored this season, there could be a possibility in which Josh Allen does not have as much overall upside because of the fact that the New York Giants don't have an offense, won't score as many points. And because of that case, it won't force Josh Allen to have to play into the fourth quarter and have to, gather up all those statistics that he potentially can. But on the other end of that argument, there's still a potential in which Josh Allen can light up the scoreboard in the first 3 quarters of the game, be his normal self, put up over 24 fantasy points, and have himself a fantastic week against a team that is struggling with a lot of injuries and has not played well thus far this season. Moving on to our number 3, we have Jalen Hurts. He takes on the New York Jets. Earlier this season, both Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen have struggled mightily against that Jets defense. I mean, Josh Allen had himself 4 turnovers in that game, and Patrick Mahomes had himself 2 turnovers. There is a possibility in which, Jalen Hurts could find himself struggling. But what we have seen in regards to quarterbacks against that defense, thus far this season, Josh Allen had 36 rushing yards against that defense, Patrick Mahomes 51 rushing yards, and most recently this last week, Russell Wilson had 49 rushing yards against the New York Jets defense. When we're talking about a quarterback that is coming off of a week in which he had 15 rushing attempts for 72 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, my expectation is that the Philadelphia Eagles, their defense specifically, is going to make it difficult for the New York Jets to move the ball. And if and when they do, this is going to be a positive game script. They'll probably be running the ball in the second half. But prior to getting to that overall position, it's going to be all Jalen Hurts lighting up the scoreboard, finding himself a lot of success within the given week. Moving on to number 4, we have Justin Fields. Like I mentioned earlier, the matchup is quite advantageous. It's the 6th best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks in terms of passing statistics isolated. So that doesn't even take into account the fact that in the last 3 games, we have seen Justin Fields accumulate 26 rushing attempts for over 120 overall rushing yards. So if in fact we can get to another position in which Justin Fields gets himself 4 fantasy points just off his rushing statistics alone, that's another additional touchdown of fantasy points on top of his scoreline. I mean, the last 2 weeks that Justin Fields has played, 617 passing yards, 8 passing touchdowns. The 3 weeks prior to that, only 3 passing touchdowns and only 526 passing yards. He's been a completely different quarterback, and now that he's found his stride, going up against the matchup against a division rival that he's familiar with, should have himself a fantastic overall week. Number 5 is Lamar Jackson. Now, even though Lamar Jackson had himself only 9.94 fantasy points last week, it's not on Lamar Jackson. It's his receivers betraying him every chance that they possibly can. I mean, when you look at the fact that Rashad Bateman dropped a receiving touchdown, Nelson Aguilar down the sideline, wide open, drops a receiving touchdown. There were multiple events last week that truly just did not go in the direction of the Baltimore Ravens, which obviously led to them losing to a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, which offensively have not been great this season. So as long as we can get into a position in which Lamar Jackson's wide receivers are not betraying him left, right, and center, hopefully he can get himself back into this top 5 conversation, because we already know that he's going to have the rushing upside. All he needs is receivers to go ahead, complete these passes, and get himself in a great position. The Tennessee Titans are the 14th best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 14 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics alone. If we're going to be in a position in which the Baltimore Ravens offense is not going to be finding much success running the ball against the Tennessee Titans front 7, primarily because outside of Zach Moss, no one really has found much success against that defense in terms of running the ball with their running backs, this should be a pass-heavy game for Lamar Jackson. Moving on to our number 6, we have Tua Tagovailoa. Again, he takes on the Carolina Panthers. The fact that he's not going to have Devon Achane within this lineup, and the fact that Devon Achane has been averaging over 12 yards per carry in the last 3 games, has had himself over 100 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown in each of the last 3 games, there's going to be a position in which this offense isn't going to be able to just easily mosey on down the field. Yes, they're going to run the ball with Raheem Mostert, but I think there's going to be more of a concerted effort of Tua Tagovailoa lighting up this defense and finding success. I mean, we just had a week in which Jared Goff went for 4 total touchdowns without Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs within this offense against that defense. I'm expecting Tua Tagovailoa to have himself an upside performance within the given week. Anytime you have Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle still within this lineup, the upside is certainly there. Moving on to our number 7, we have Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, in the last 3 games that he's played against the Indianapolis Colts, once earlier this season in week 1 and twice last year, he has had an 82% passing completion percentage, and he is averaging 20.38 fantasy points per game against that defense. He's coming off of a great week against a great defense in the Buffalo Bills, and even though the Buffalo Bills were dealing with a lot of injuries, no Tre'Davious White, no Matt Milano, obviously midway through that game, there is a conversation to be had with Trevor Lawrence taking on a defense and a secondary that has not played well this season. Again, the Colts have given up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. We're expecting a big game out of Calvin Ridley this given week. And the fact that Trevor Lawrence, in the last couple games against the Indianapolis Colts, has seen a base minimum of 2 touchdowns in each of those games, and the fact that they play at home, the Jaguars are 8-0 in the last 8 home games against the Colts, I'm expecting Trevor Lawrence to have himself a big week. Number 8 is Justin Herbert. They take on the Dallas Cowboys. This is a revenge game for Kellen Moore. It's time to prove to the Dallas Cowboys, to Jerry Jones, to Mike McCarthy, that the play calling tactics of the last couple seasons, really was the reason why this offense found any sort of success in comparison to what they've looked like thus far this season. It's going to be up to Justin Herbert, obviously coming off of the bye week. His left hand should be, healthy, ready to go. On top of it, they get Austin Eckler back. Austin Eckler provides a facet to this offense that they were not utilizing in the last couple games without him. Getting the running back involved in the receiving game really has not been a priority in the last couple weeks with guys like Isaiah Spiller and or Joshua Kelly. With Austin Eckler returning, it only opens up more upside and more opportunity for Justin Herbert to just dump it off in the backfield and let Austin Eckler gather so many yards that he does on a typical weekly basis. Thus far this season, Justin Herbert has scored 20-plus fantasy points in each of his 4 games. I'm expecting the Cowboys defense, even though they've played tough this season, to be diced up by Justin Herbert. Our number 9 is Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow looked incredible. The fact that he was able to stay healthy, the fact that he was scrambling 4 first downs and running the ball, that is a huge difference maker in comparison to where we saw him a couple weeks back on Monday Night Football against the Los Angeles Rams. He finally looks healthy, and he even said it last week that this is the healthiest he's been all season. So now that we're getting into a position in which Joe Burrow is healthy, potentially gets T. Higgins back in the given week, they take on the Seattle Seahawks, the 8th best matchup at the position, allowing over 15 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks in terms of passing statistics alone. I'm expecting another big performance here, primarily because as long as you have Jamar Chase in the lineup and a healthy Joe Burrow, they're always going to have themselves potential for upside. He's coming off of a week in which he had 78% passing completion percentage. That's primarily because of the fact that he targeted Jamar Chase 19 times. As long as he continues to do that, of course, they're going to find themselves a lot of fantasy upside. Moving on to our number 10, we have Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins, already thus far this season, has been one of the more consistent quarterbacks at the position, primarily because this is a pass-first offense. In terms of pass rate amongst all teams in the National Football League, they're number 1, passing the ball 70% of the time. Not only that, thus far this season, he has had 2 passing touchdowns in each of his last 5 games. And he's going into a matchup against the Chicago Bears, which is the 2nd best matchup at the position, allowing over 20 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics alone. And even without Justin Jefferson, there is going to be upside for Christian Kirk. The receiving options of TJ Hockenson, Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne, Alexander Madison, they will be enough to be able to suffice in the given week, in the given matchup, to make Kirk Cousins a top 10 option at the quarterback position. Moving on to our number 11, we have Brock Purdy. Even though Brock Purdy has a difficult matchup, the fact of the matter is, thus far this season, he has scored 11 touchdowns in 5 games, 0 interceptions. He continues to ball out every single week, and considering the Browns are most likely not going to have Deshaun Watson and it'll be PJ Walker, this defense is just going to continue to get them the ball back. And when they do, they're just going to pour it on to the Cleveland Browns defense and find themselves a lot of success within the given week. A lot of 3-and-outs, a lot of short fields makes it a very enticing overall opportunity for Brock Purdy. Just like it was on Sunday Night Football against the Dallas Cowboys, Dak Prescott throwing 3 interceptions obviously led to those short field opportunities that led to a lot of touchdowns, 4 passing touchdowns specifically for Brock Purdy. Number 12 is Jared Goff. He's coming off of the best fantasy performance he's had this season, with both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs out within the given game. If you're going to be able to perform at that high of a level without 2 of your primary options, not only your number 1 wide receiver, but probably one of your better playmakers with Jahmyr Gibbs, even though they have really given him a lack of opportunity thus far this season, the fact that they were still able to perform as well as they did against the Carolina Panthers, who have in their secondary played very well this season, is ridiculous. Going into the upcoming matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, there is an expectation that this could be a higher scoring game. This could be a trap game, quote unquote, for the Detroit Lions. They're firing on all cylinders. They're one of the best offenses in the National Football League. I'm not worried about them. I'm not worried about Jared Goff. Should have himself a great game with a potential return of Amon-Ra St. Brown and Gibbs. Number 13 is Matthew Stafford. Even though from weeks 1 through 4, Matthew Stafford, 1 passing touchdown a game was his average, that's fine. But now that you've gotten Cooper Kupp back, immediately jump to the next conversation of getting himself 2 passing touchdowns, over 16 fantasy points. And now we're kind of positioning ourselves in a matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, where we've most recently seen Brock Purdy tear apart this team, 20 of 21 passing. And of course, Joe Burrow had himself a day last week with over 300 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. There is an opportunity on hand for Matthew Stafford to have himself another upside performance against a division rival in which he's familiar with his defense. The expectation against the 7th best matchup at the position is for Matthew Stafford to have himself 250 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and himself a great overall fantasy performance. Moving on to our number 14, Geno Smith coming off of the bye week. The last time we saw him against the New York Giants was hit late on the sideline, ended up rolling his ankle. He taped it, was able to return to the game, but was not himself fully. If he's going to be at a full capacity taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, I expect this to be more of a shootout than a lot of others believe. I think this can be a game in which Geno Smith can get back to that overall performance in which we saw earlier this season against the Detroit Lions, a very high-scoring game between these 2 high-powered offenses. Moving on to our number 15, we have Russell Wilson. He plays later tonight. Russell Wilson this season has been far better than last year. That is a given. Sean Payton has certainly helped him out a lot, and even though he is turning over the ball in inopportune times, the fact of the matter is, for fantasy purposes, Russell Wilson has been great. He's been the number 8 overall quarterback in fantasy football in the first 5 weeks, and primarily because he's played against some terrible teams. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Kansas City Chiefs, even though the Kansas City Chiefs defense is great, in the last 2 games that Russell Wilson has taken on this defense last year, 25 fantasy points, 23 fantasy points. When you could put up that great of an overall performance against this defense late last season, where they were firing on all cylinders defensively, going into the Thursday night matchup on a short week, my expectation is that Russell Wilson should have himself another good game. 4 out of the last 5 games he's played this season, 2 or more overall touchdowns. We're hoping for that once again tonight against this defense. The final quarterback I wanted to mention is CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud has been able to get himself over 242 passing yards in each of his last 5 games. So pretty much 9.6 fantasy points guaranteed in terms of passing yardage. If he's able to get back into the conversation of 2 passing touchdowns, by all means, we're in a conversation where he's putting up over 15 fantasy points, which is pretty much all we need within a given week at the quarterback position, with the potential of upside. He does take on the New Orleans Saints. It is not an easy matchup, and even though he has 0 turnovers in terms of interceptions this season, he does have 5 turnover-worthy plays. Against the defense that has already intercepted the quarterback 6 times, I hope that CJ Stroud just comes out and throws a pick to begin the game, get it out of his system, and then just balls out and airs it out for the remainder of the game, considering how difficult it will be for the Houston Texans offense to run the ball against the New Orleans Saints defense. All right, that's going to cover for me today in terms of rankings. Let's go ahead and close out today's episode with a couple pick'em subs via Underdog Fantasy before the Thursday night football game. Let's check that out. All right, so going into tonight's game, there are a couple plays that I really do like. Specifically, number 1, Russell Wilson going higher than his overall 3.5 rushing attempts. The expectation is that if in fact we even get into a situation where maybe in the late end of the first half he needs the ball in order to kill the clock, there's 1 rushing attempt. But over the course of this season, he's been rushing the ball far more. And with those overall opportunities that we have seen in 3 out of the last 4 games, I'm going to expect for Russell Wilson to get out of the pocket and get to gaining a lot of rushing statistics. I'm not going to go ahead and put a number on terms of overall rushing yards, because if in fact we get into a situation in which he needs the ball at the end of the first half, we can get an additional rushing attempt there, which ends up saving our overall week. the expectation is that he can go higher than this overall number. Now, there are other players, other plays specifically in numbers that I like. Javonte Williams, 11.5 receiving yards, I like, but we know that Samaje Perine and Jaleel McLaughlin are both capable receiving options within this backfield. Even though I like this number, I'm not going to specifically take it. Now, when we go ahead and put together a pick'em slip in regards to Underdog Fantasy, you have to have players on multiple teams. So we're going to have to immediately go to the other side of this conversation in regards to the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm expecting Patrick Mahomes to have himself a great game, but I think Isaiah Pacheco is in line for a monster performance, primarily because of the fact that he takes on one of the easiest matchups at the position. They're giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running back in terms of rushing statistics isolated, over 20 points per game. There is a conversation in which Isaiah Pacheco, 14.55 fantasy points overall, should be taken higher. But I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make it easy on myself. I'm going to go and I'm going to select the kicker, Harrison Butker, surpassing 1.5 field goals made. He's been able to surpass this number in 4 out of the last 5 games this season. Those are the 2 safest. Now, if you want another one of these kind of plays that could end up hitting, I think Trent McDuffie works. So if I was to put together a slip, I would probably end up going Russell Wilson higher than his 3.5 rushing attempts, Trent McDuffie higher than 5.0 total tackles assists. I think that's a number that he could very easily accomplish within tonight's game. Especially considering, if that entire offense is throwing the ball for the majority of the game because they're in a negative game script, Russell Wilson will give a lot of opportunity to the secondary members of this offense making tackles. And of course, Trent McDuffie could be one of those guys. Alongside of that, of course, it would be Isaiah Pacheco, surpassing that overall fantasy number of 14.55 fantasy points. Again, for right now, I'm just going to go with the Harrison Butker play alongside of Russell Wilson and his overall rushing attempts. That'll be the pick'em slip that I put forth tonight. We'll see what the results look like. I will be live streaming later tonight on the channel after the Thursday night football game. Be sure to stop on by and check that out. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew and make that first-time deposit, because if in fact you do so tonight by signing up and using code Andrew and making that first-time deposit minimum of $10, you'll also be able to put Patrick Mahomes 0.5 total yards within that given slip. You can put 2 to 5 players within a given slip and go ahead and find yourself success via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll see you guys later tonight or tomorrow for must-start players. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.